When an old veteran counted coins for bread and came up short, nobody in that store expected the black man in the oil-stained work shirt to be the one who stopped everything. The jar hit the counter and coins scattered. Quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies rolling in every direction, one spinning off the edge and ringing flat on the floor. Not a loud sound, but in the hush of that checkout line, it was enough to make every head turn. The old man's hands were shaking. Not fear. The tremor of a body that had given more than it received for too many decades. His fingers moved through the coins with desperate precision, sorting and resorting, as if one more pass might close the gap between what he had and what he owed. His name was Edward Mills. 78 years old, tan windbreaker, small American flag pin on the lapel. His groceries sat beside the jar, day-old bread marked down, a can of soup, margarine, bananas going soft. The careful choices of a man who knows his number. He had counted the coins at home. He was certain he had enough. He was $3 short. "Sir." The cashier's voice carried the flatness of someone who has decided efficiency excuses everything else. Lauren Hayes was 24, part-time, with a line of 6 people behind this old man, and a break already 20 minutes away. "You're still short. $3. Edward looked at the coins, looked at her, looked back at the coins. I thought I had it," he said. Low, controlled, a wire pulled taut underneath. Behind him someone exhaled. Not a sigh. A performance of impatience. A man in a golf shirt checked his watch. A woman with a full cart shifted her weight and studied the ceiling. The collective unspoken verdict: this old man was the problem. Pay the difference or put something back. Lauren's eyes swept the line, then returned to his face, without warmth, without theatrics. "You're holding everyone up." Edward reached into the jar again, turned it over, shook out the last coins. A penny rolled off the edge and rang on the floor. He didn't bend to pick it up. He couldn't. Not gracefully, not in front of all these people. He watched it roll until it stopped. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just need a minute." "We don't really have a minute," Lauren said. Not raised, not harsh. Clipped. The tone you use with a child taking too long with their shoes. Then she reached for the antibacterial dispenser and pumped a measure into her palm, rubbing her hands together slowly, deliberately. It had nothing to do with hygiene. Edward saw it. His jaw shifted. The specific adjustment of a man who has held himself upright for 78 years and just felt the ground tilt under him. The line said nothing. The silence of a room that has witnessed something small and cruel and chosen to let it pass. It was at that moment that the man behind him stepped forward. Broad through the shoulders, solid through the chest, with hands built for gripping things and holding them steady. Dark blue work shirt, name embroidered in yellow thread, Darius. A trace of motor oil along one forearm. Boots with serious miles on them. 46 years old, with the face of a man who watches carefully before he decides. He didn't push through, didn't announce himself. He placed one hand on the counter beside the coins, reached into his back pocket, and laid down a folded bill. $100. Worn soft at the folds, not spent casually, not forgotten in a wallet. A bill you feel when you put it down. Lauren looked at the bill, then at him. Her eyes moved from the oil-stained shirt to the boots to his face, and something recalibrated in her expression, fast, unconscious, running ahead of her better instincts before they had a chance to catch up. She picked up the bill between 2 fingers, held it toward the light. Then she looked at him again, slowly, the way you look at something you have already decided not to trust. "This is..." A pause, doing its own work. "You are sure this is okay to use?" The line went quiet in a way it hadn't before. Not impatience, heavier. the quiet of a room registering that the terms of what was happening had changed. Darius Washington looked at her. He did not raise his voice. He did not shift his expression. He held her gaze through a long, still beat. The silence of a man who has been asked versions of that question before and has made his peace with the cost of answering it. "Yes," he said. "I'm sure." The man in the golf shirt had stopped checking his watch. The woman with the full cart was no longer looking at the ceiling. Edward Mills turned and looked at Darius for the first time. Not at the gesture, at the man. Something was moving in the old man's face, reaching toward a place it hadn't visited in a very long time. Whatever it was, he didn't say it yet, but his hands had stopped shaking. There is a version of Darius Washington's life that reads simply from the distance. He drives a truck, works long hours, comes home to a house in Millfield Heights, modest streets on Crestwood's eastern edge, small lawns, cars older than their payments. He has a 15-year-old daughter named Mia who is, by every honest measure, better than he deserves. He drives a 2009 Chevy pickup with 218,000 miles on it and a rear window that doesn't seal when it rains. He has a tattoo on his left forearm. Dignity, plain block letters. He got it at 23, 3 months after his second deployment ended, in a shop off Fort Bragg, because he needed to put the words somewhere he could see it on the mornings he felt like forgetting it. The years after the Army were years he doesn't lay out in sequence for Mia. She knows the broad shape. Her father came home from the service when she was 3, spent some time figuring things out, got his CDL, found work that suited him. Solitary, physical, governed by logistics rather than people. What she doesn't know is the 18 months cycling through 3 jobs and 2 couches. She doesn't know about the anxiety that made standing in a grocery line feel like the walls were deciding to move. She doesn't know about the VA appointments, or the counselor who told him dignity wasn't something you lost and found. It was something you practiced, like a trade skill, until it holds. She knows he makes scrambled eggs with hot sauce every Sunday, always enough for 2, even when she sleeps past 10. She knows he has never raised his voice at her in anger, and that when he finally speaks after listening, it's worth waiting for. What she doesn't see yet, because she is 15 and some things take years to come into focus, is the cost of that steadiness. How much work it takes every day to be the man he is. Every morning he's up at 4:15. Coffee from a machine missing its carafe lid. Lunch in a blue cooler under the kitchen table. 40 minutes to the Callaway Logistics Depot on Route 9, where the next 10 to 12 hours are freight moving through the region's invisible circulatory system. He is good at his job. His record is clean. He makes decent money for what it is. Not comfortable money, no give in it. Rent is $1,200 a month. He sends money to his mother in Savannah every month. Track gear, school supplies, the occasional urgent need for the next book in a series Mia is consuming. Utility bills that climb regardless of the thermostat. He knows his account balance at all times, with the same reflex other people use for weather. He had come to Meadowbrook today for one thing: a box of pasta. He had $12 on him and the 100 tucked behind his license, an emergency margin he'd been carrying for 3 weeks without touching. He had not planned to touch it today. The plan was pasta and home and dinner ready when Mia got back from track practice. A complete circuit, a good evening. Then he got in line behind Edward Mills. He watched the old man sort his coins, watched Lauren's expression recalibrate, watched the penny roll off the edge and ring on the floor. He felt the line behind him, the accumulated weight of small judgments, a crowd that had collectively decided what this old man was worth and arrived at not much. Darius knew that texture. Not this exact form, not this age, not this war. But he knew what it was to stand somewhere public and feel the people around you decide you weren't worth the time it took to see you. He'd had enough practice to recognize it from either side of a counter. There was also the guilt he'd carried quietly since Mia's 13th birthday. A double shift, he told himself, was unavoidable. He came home at 11 to a dark house, a cake she'd made herself in the refrigerator, and a note on the table in her handwriting. "It's okay, Dad. I know you're tired." He stood in that kitchen for a long time, thinking about the man he was trying to be. He had a rule, unspoken, unwritten, just lived. He would not walk past the moment when someone needed to be seen. Not because it was always easy, not because he could always afford it, but because dignity, the word on his forearm, had to be chosen when it cost something, or it was just ink. Mia was meeting him here. Track practice let out at 4. Meadowbrook was on her bus route, and on days when it lined up, they walked home together. She'd be here in 20 minutes, maybe 30. He had no plan beyond what he'd already done. He only knew he couldn't leave an old man standing in the accumulated small cruelties of a checkout line, and then go home and make pasta and feel right about the face in the mirror. So he hadn't left. He'd set the 100 on the counter, and now he was standing in the charged, strange quiet of the moment after, while Lauren held his bill toward the light and asked him a question that wasn't a question at all. Lauren put the 100 down on the counter, but didn't open the register. "I'm going to need a manager to approve this," she said. Smooth, procedural, a rule that may or may not exist. Darius had spent enough years around systems to know the difference between a policy that protects a business and one invented on the spot to purchase time. He couldn't be certain which this was. That uncertainty was, of course, the point. "Go ahead," he said. She picked up the phone receiver. "Manager to lane 4? Set it down, and turned to something below the counter, making a point of not making eye contact with either man in front of her. Then she reached for the sanitizer. Right after handling Edward's coins, slowly, deliberately, her eyes carrying the faint disgust of someone performing a private verdict in a public space. The woman with the full cart noticed. The man who'd been checking his watch noticed. A murmur moved through the back of the line, no specific words, but a meaning that was entirely clear. One position back, a 17-year-old named Marcus had his phone angled toward the register. Casually, the way you hold it when you want the option of having caught something. The line had not dispersed. If anything, it had tightened. 3 of the original 6 remaining, 2 new arrivals who'd read the situation and chosen to stay. The woman with the full cart had migrated 2 feet closer. Edward stood to the side now, groceries already bagged. Lauren had done that automatically before the shortage registered, his coin jar in both hands. The posture of a man long accustomed to waiting out verdicts. Upright, controlled, bearing something in his shoulders that Darius recognized as old and practiced endurance. The manager arrived. Greg Parton, mid-40s, blue polo, clipboard he never consulted. He looked at the 100, looked at Darius. "What seems to be the issue here?" Lauren explained efficiently, with the edge of someone filing a report. A customer had attempted to cover another customer's purchase with a large bill she'd had difficulty verifying, and the customer had not provided identification. Darius had not been asked for identification. Greg looked at him. "Sir, do you have an ID we could take a look at?" "For buying groceries?" Darius said. "It's just procedure when—" "It's not procedure." She didn't run the verification pen. She held the bill up for 2 seconds and called you. "I've never been asked for ID to pay at a grocery store." "I understand your frustration." "I'm not frustrated," Darius said. "I'm being accurate." A different murmur from the line. Not impatience. Attention. The security guard near the entrance had drifted toward lane 4, not rushing, repositioning. Movement that carries meaning without technically doing anything yet. Greg said, "Sir, if you could just show us your ID, we process the transaction and if I show it to you?" Darius said. "Will the bill suddenly become valid? Or will the next step be something else?" The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was the silence of a room that had just understood the shape of what was happening and hadn't decided what to do with that understanding. Darius looked at Edward, kept his voice low, just the 2 of them. "You were stationed in Da Nang," he said, "weren't you?" Not a question, a recognition. Edward went still. Not the stillness of surprise, the precise stillness of a man whose awareness has registered something his conscious mind hasn't fully processed yet. He looked at Darius slowly. His jaw shifted. Something moved behind his eyes, a door opening a crack, a shape beginning to form. But he said nothing. He just looked at Darius. And kept looking. The crowd, which had been murmuring and shifting and recording, went quiet. Whatever was happening between those two men at the register, it wasn't readable from the outside, but it had changed the temperature of the room. Greg made a decision. Not a dramatic one, the kind managers make when situations grow inconvenient. Impose structure, let process substitute for judgment. He wasn't acting from malice. He genuinely believed he was doing the correct thing. That was the specific texture of the injustice unfolding at Lane 4. It didn't require a villain. It only required a man who had confused procedure with fairness and had too much momentum to stop. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you to step to the back office to complete the verification. It'll only take a few minutes." Troy, the security guard, moved to position himself behind Darius. Not between him and the door, not technically threatening, close enough that the geometry was unmistakable. The woman with the full cart said, just loud enough to carry, "This is ridiculous." Her tone left it genuinely unclear who she meant. That ambiguity was its own indictment. Darius did not move. He stood still, hands at his sides, and looked at Greg with an expression that had gone very quiet. Not the quiet of compliance, but of a man who has been here before and knows that raising his voice will only make it worse. "Lauren," Greg said, "call Troy's supervisor." Lauren picked up the phone, then turned and repeated the ID demand louder, aimed outward, volume substituting for legitimacy. "We need to check your ID, sir." The words carried across the checkout area and landed in the open air of the store. Mia walked through the front door. Still in her track warm-ups, dark blue, school name in yellow across the chest, earbuds around her neck, backpack on one shoulder. She scanned the store with the fast reflex of a kid who always knows where her parent is. She found her father at Lane 4. She stopped. 3 seconds to read the room. The guard behind her father, the manager, Lauren's raised voice still hanging in the air, the phones up and recording. She read it the way she had learned to read rooms, quietly, without letting the reading show. She took one step forward. Troy shifted, not toward Mia, but the movement was enough. A wall being reinforced. Darius was trapped in the geometry of it. The guard behind him, the manager in front, the register to his side, and now his daughter at the edge of all of it, watching. He couldn't walk forward. He couldn't walk back. He couldn't make this better by saying anything, and he couldn't make it better by staying silent. Every option in that Lane 4 led to the same place. A black man surrounded, a crowd watching, a 15-year-old girl learning what that looked like. He did not fight it. He stood still and absorbed it. At the back of the line, a man said, no attempt to lower his voice. "This always happens, every single time." He meant it one way. Half the room heard it another. Nobody answered. The silence that followed had the dense, suffocating weight of a space handed something too loaded to agree on. Edward had his head down. Standing to the side, peripheral now, groceries at his feet, coin jar in his hands, chin toward his chest. Not crumbling. Bearing the specific shame of a man who came in to buy bread, asked for nothing, and became the reason a decent stranger was now surrounded and demanded of, with no way to undo it. Lauren hung up the phone. "Supervisor will be here in 5, she announced. Mia made a sound. Small, involuntary. The sound that escapes when what you're holding becomes too heavy. Her hand went over her mouth. Her eyes were wet and bright. She was 15 years old, watching her father hemmed in from every direction, and she could not do anything about it. and she was fighting hard not to let the full weight of that show on her face. Darius turned and looked at her. Just for a moment. One small nod, the kind that carries more than most speeches, and then he turned back. He did not look at the manager. He did not look at Troy. He looked at a fixed point on the counter in front of him, and waited. Because waiting was the only move he had left. The shame in the room had spread past Edward now. It had gotten into the walls. Edward set his bag down on the ledge beside the register. Not a tired movement, a decided one. He set the coin jar beside it and walked the 2 steps to the counter and stood beside Darius. He said nothing. The standing was its own statement. A 78-year-old white man in a veteran's windbreaker, next to a 46-year-old black man in an oil-stained work shirt, side by side at the register, while a manager and a guard and a line of strangers with recording phones waited for whatever came next. Troy recalibrated. His position no longer made any sense. He held where he was. Edward looked at Darius's left forearm, the tattoo below the rolled cuff. Dignity, block letters. Then his eyes moved to Darius's hands resting flat on the counter. Open, still. The hands of a man trained in the discipline of waiting when everything in him wants to move. He looked at the hands for a long time. Then he looked at the face, then back at the hands. His breathing had changed. Slower, deliberate, managing something internal that he could not afford to lose control of here. Then, in a voice so low that only Darius could hear it, Edward said a number. 7 digits, spoken in a specific cadence, the rhythm of a military service number, the kind memorized and repeated in the contexts where men needed to confirm who was who when nothing else could. He did not look away from Darius when he said it. He said it the way you set down something you've been carrying for 50 years. Darius did not confirm, did not deny. He held Edward's gaze through the silence that followed. Steady, patient, giving nothing away but not pulling back either. Edward began to shake. Not the tremor from before. This was deeper. The shaking that happens when a body encounters something the mind has braced against for decades and suddenly cannot hold the bracing together. His jaw tightened. His eyes had gone bright and wet in a way he was determinedly, visibly refusing to let become anything larger in this store, in front of all these strangers. The crowd had shifted. The people who minutes ago had been recording with quiet judgment had gone still in a new way. Not the stillness of an audience between acts, but of people who sense they are standing at the edge of something that is not their story to interpret yet. Cameras still up, but held differently. No longer hunting. Lauren had stopped moving behind the register. Her procedural flatness was gone. Something rawer had replaced it. Something that looked, if she was being honest, with the full weight of the afternoon pressing on her, like the first movement of shame beginning its slow work. Edward opened his mouth, closed it, breathed in through his nose, long and controlled. He reached into the inner pocket of his windbreaker and pressed his hand against something through the fabric. Did not withdraw it yet, just confirmed it was there. "I have something," he said, still barely above a whisper, only for Darius. "I've been carrying it for a long time. I need to wait for the right moment." "Okay," Darius said. One word. No pressure, no urgency. The word of a man who understands that some things cannot be rushed. Troy had taken several steps back, not retreating, just redistributing, the unconscious adjustment of a man who has realized he was standing too close to something he had fundamentally misread. Edward straightened to his full height. He was not a large man, but standing there, in that moment, he carried himself like someone who has just remembered exactly who he is. The supervisor's name was Brian. Younger than Greg, same polo, arriving with the energy of someone briefed in transit and already certain of his position. He came to stand beside Greg, looked at Darius, and said, "Sir, we're going to need you to step away from the register." Not the back office this time. Away from the register. as if Darius standing at the counter was itself the problem that needed solving. Mia's composure broke. She had been holding herself together for the last several minutes, jaw set, eyes wet, one hand pressed over her mouth. But when she heard those words and watched Brian step forward and Troy move in closer from behind, something gave way. She pressed both hands to her face. Her shoulders shook. 15 years old, standing 8 feet from her father, while strangers with institutional authority moved to remove him from a grocery store. And there was nothing she could do. Darius saw her. He turned just briefly, and what moved across his face in that moment was the only thing in the entire afternoon that had gotten through his composure. Not the manager, not the security guard, not the questions about the bill. His daughter crying. That was the thing. He turned back, took a breath, and then, with a steadiness that cost him more than anything visible, he began to step back from the register. He was going to let them do it. Not because he agreed, not because it was right. Because he had made the calculation that every black man in that position eventually makes. That resistance would only make it worse, and that the most powerful thing left to him was to leave with his dignity intact, even if they didn't know that was what they were watching. No? Edward Mills stepped forward. He said it without raising his voice. He said it in the register of a man who has given orders and received them, and knows the difference between authority that has something behind it and authority that is noise in a uniform. He placed himself between Darius and Brian. One step, deliberate, squared up, settled. No one in this store has the right to remove this man. Brian blinked. Sir, this doesn't... It concerns me. Level, unmovable. He paid for my groceries. He asked for nothing. He stood at this register and was treated like a suspect for handing over a clean bill. And now you are telling him to step away. He looked at Brian, then Greg, then Lauren. The unvarnished disappointment of a man who expected better and has lived too long to be surprised. No. He reached into the inner pocket of his windbreaker. Slow. Careful. The care of a man handling something that has required care for a very long time. He withdrew his wallet, old brown leather worn to a suppleness that takes decades, opened it, and reached past everything else to what was kept behind his license. He withdrew a photograph. Small, field-printed, edges worn soft, image faded to the warm ochre of photographs from that era. Folded once, long ago, crease that never fully smoothed. He held it up. 2 soldiers. One was down, legs at an angle that communicated injury without ambiguity. The other was carrying him, arms hooked under his knees and shoulders, head low, body angled forward, moving across open ground toward safety. The carrying man's face was turned away from the camera. You could not see it, but you could see the size of him, the breadth of his shoulders, the specific grip of his hands. Strength and care not as opposites, but as the same thing at the same moment. Edward looked at the photograph. Then he looked at Darius, at his shoulders, at his hands, at the specific way he had been standing at that counter for the last 15 minutes. Then he looked at the room. This man, he said, quiet, entirely clear, every word load-bearing, carried my son off a field under fire. Thomas Edward Mills, 22 years old, 3 weeks from rotating home. He stopped. The weight of decades moved through his voice, not breaking it, but making itself known. He went back to his unit without leaving a name. He asked for nothing. And Thomas came home. He lowered the photograph for a moment, looked at it, then raised his eyes to the store. I have been looking at this photograph for over 50 years. Looking at these hands. He looked at Darius. And the moment I walked into this store today, the moment I saw this man step forward and set down that bill without a word, without asking for anything. I recognized those hands. The room was completely still. Near the back, barely audible. Oh my God. The woman with the full cart had both hands pressed to her mouth. The man in the golf shirt was looking at the floor. Marcus held the camera differently now, not hunting, witnessing. At the back of the line, a woman in her 70s began to cry, quietly, without drama, the way people cry when something beautiful and something terrible arrive at the same moment, and there is no separating them. Then, one pair of hands somewhere near the back, then another, then, the way release moves through a room that has been holding its breath, the applause spread, built, filled the store. Brian stood motionless. Greg held his clipboard and looked at nothing in particular. Lauren stood behind her register with her hands at her sides, face open in a way it hadn't been since the beginning, stripped of its procedural distance, something raw underneath. A young woman confronting at full weight what small cruelties can stand in front of without knowing what they are blocking. Darius had not moved. Hands open on the counter, eyes on Edward. And his face, that carefully maintained face, steady through every minute of this afternoon, had let something through. Not grief, not only that. The specific vertigo of having the world rearrange itself in a moment. This old man, this photograph, these hands, this store. Mia walked to him and took his hand. That was all. She walked to her father and took his hand and stood beside him. Darius closed his fingers around hers, and neither of them said anything, and the applause kept building. Not the applause of a performance, but of a room given back something it didn't know it was missing. Edward lowered the photograph, looked at it for a moment, then placed it back in the wallet, carefully behind his license in its place, where it had lived for over 50 years. The video went wide before midnight. Marcus Reyes posted 4 minutes and 11 seconds of footage, beginning with Edward stepping forward, ending with Mia taking her father's hand, with a caption that was 3 words. This happened today. By the time he went to sleep, the clip had been seen by considerably more than his 19,000 followers. By the next morning, it had spread to accounts with reaches in the hundreds of thousands. By that afternoon, Meadowbrook Food Mart's corporate communications team was in a meeting that had not been on anyone's calendar. The comments were not ambiguous. By Thursday, 3 local news affiliates had run segments. By Friday, a national morning program had requested interviews with both Edward and Darius, relayed through the store, which now held their contact information, under very different circumstances than those under which it had tried to obtain it 48 hours earlier. Greg Parton issued a written apology to Darius on Wednesday afternoon, drafted with evident legal assistance, warm in the measured way such documents can manage. It acknowledged that the store's response had been inconsistent with their values of respectful service to all customers. It did not mention the pen. Darius read it once, replied briefly, and moved on. Lauren Hayes was placed on administrative suspension pending review. A corporate spokesperson confirmed it publicly. Does not reflect our standards, and thorough review of customer service protocols. Lauren did not speak to the press. Several co-workers said she had called in, not to dispute anything, but to say she was sorry, that she had not understood, and that she knew that wasn't an excuse, but she was trying to understand it now. Which is not absolution, but it may be the beginning of something. The corporate review produced revised guidelines for the chain's 18 regional locations, mandatory de-escalation training for all customer-facing staff, and a written clarification of currency verification procedure. Run the pen, complete the transaction, escalate only on confirmed grounds. Exactly what Darius had described at the register while the pen sat unused 10 inches from Lauren's hand. Adopted within 3 weeks. Not front-page news. The kind of change that happens quietly and matters specifically to the people it affects. At a community meeting organized by the local Veterans Services Office, convened in direct response to the video, a proposal passed to establish a small assistance fund for veterans in the Crestwood area on fixed incomes, grocery shortfalls, utility bills, prescription co-pays. The seed money came from a collection taken up at the local VFW post. More came in from strangers online who had watched 4 minutes and 11 seconds and needed somewhere to put what they felt. Darius was invited to speak at the meeting. He declined in a handwritten note on actual paper, which the organizer found both anachronistic and unexpectedly moving. He sent Edward in his place. Edward spoke for 8 minutes in the plain, unadorned way of a man who has lived long enough to say what he means without decoration. When he finished, the room held its quiet. The quiet of a space in which something true has just been said, and everyone present knows it. When a reporter reached Darius by phone and asked what he wanted people to take from what happened, he was quiet for a moment. Then, I want people to think about how many Edward Millses are out there. People who served. People who worked their whole lives. People standing in a line somewhere right now counting their coins, hoping the total comes out right. I want people to think about what it costs someone to be made small in public. That's what I want. The reporter asked if he had anything to say to the store. "Please never humiliate Mr. Edward again," Darius said, without hesitation. That is all. Several publications quoted it exactly. The kind of sentence that cannot be improved by adding anything to it. He stopped at the bakery on Clement Street on the way home. Small place, no sign visible from the road. Mia had found it in the fall by accident, followed her nose through the door after a Saturday practice, spent $4 of her $7 on a slice of cardamom coffee cake, and described it to Darius that evening with the reverence teenagers reserve for things that genuinely move them. He'd been meaning to go back ever since. He sat in the truck outside for a moment before going in. The engine ticked as it cooled. Through the bakery window, he could see a woman behind the counter arranging something in a glass case, unhurried, the movement of someone who has done this 10,000 times and still finds it worth doing carefully. The smell reached him even through the closed windows, warm, spiced, the particular comfort of something made by hand. He thought about Edward standing at that register, about the photograph, about the specific way the old man's voice had sounded when he said Thomas came home. Not relief, not triumph, just the plain, bedrock fact of it. The fact he had been carrying for 50 years like a stone in his chest that had finally, in a fluorescent-lit grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon, been set down somewhere it could rest. He thought about Mia's hand in his. He got out of the truck and went inside. He bought a small cardamom coffee cake, boxed in paper. The woman behind the counter wrapped it with the same unhurried care he'd watched through the window, folded the paper at the corners, pressed a strip of tape across the fold. "Special occasion?" she asked. Darius thought about it. "Something like that," he said. He carried it to the truck and drove home. Mia was at the kitchen table, textbook open, pencil moving, glass of water and phone within reach, her specific version of studying. She looked up when she heard the door. Her eyes went to the box. "Is that—" "Clement Street," he said. She got up and hugged him. Not a hug asking for context, just her arms around him, steady and warm. A daughter communicating to a father that she is glad he is here and glad he is himself. He held on a beat longer than usual, chin at the top of her head, the bakery box still in one hand. He closed his eyes. In the whole, long, strange wait of the day, the coins on the counter, the pen that never got used, Troy repositioning himself, Brian's voice saying, "Step away from the register." This was the part that undid him slightly. Not the hard part, the easy part. His daughter's arms around him in a kitchen that smelled like the candles she'd been burning earlier, some vanilla thing she'd gotten at the school fair and burned down to a stub over 3 weeks. He let go before she could feel him holding on too hard. She stepped back and looked at him with the direct, measuring quality that was one of her most consistent traits. The look that meant she was running the full diagnostic, checking him against some internal baseline she'd been calibrating since she was old enough to understand that her father carried things he didn't always say out loud. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "I am." She held the answer in her gaze one more second, measuring it, weighing it, then nodded, satisfied, and went back to her textbook. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment after she turned away, watching her pick up her pencil. The way she tucked one foot under her when she settled back into her chair, the particular angle of her head when she was concentrating. He had missed her 13th birthday for a double shift, and he would never fully stop paying that debt to himself. But he was here tonight, and the cake was on the counter, and she was 3 feet away doing her homework in a warm kitchen, and some things did not need to be said to be real. He made tea, put the box on the table between them. After a while, she reached over without asking and broke off a piece, and he did the same, and they sat like that, textbook open, tea cooling, while October evening settled around the house earlier than expected, the sky going amber, then gray through the window above the sink. The cardamom was stronger than he remembered from her description, warmer. He understood now why she'd spent $4 of her $7 on it without hesitation. At some point, Mia turned her phone toward him. The video had been running in the background of her day since school. She hadn't shown it to him directly until now. He watched it. Watched Edward raise the photograph. Watched himself at the counter, hands open. Watched her cross the floor and take his hand. From outside, it was a different thing than it had been from inside. From inside, it was just his daughter, her hand, the fact of her presence. From outside, it looked like something finished, something complete. He said nothing when it ended. She turned the phone back around. "People are being really kind," she said. "In the comments." "Some of them," he said. "Most of them," she said. Probably accurate for this video. Probably generous about the internet in general. And he let it stand. She was quiet for a moment, turning the phone face down on the table. Then she said, without looking up, "Were you scared?" He considered the question the way he considered all her real questions, seriously, without deflecting toward the easier answer. "Not scared," he said. "Tired. There's a kind of tired that comes from having to be very careful all the time, from knowing that if you react the wrong way, it gets worse. That kind of tired." She looked at him then. Really looked at him. Not the diagnostic look from earlier, something older than that. The look of a 15-year-old who is in the process of understanding something about the world that she would have preferred not to understand yet. "Does it happen a lot?" she asked. "Things like that?" He thought about how to answer, about all the versions of that afternoon that existed in his life, the smaller ones, the ones that didn't get filmed, the ones that resolved without a photograph being raised or applause building from the back of a store. The times he'd taken the long way around a thing because the short way carried too much risk. The times he'd let something pass because the cost of not letting it pass was too high. "Sometimes," he said. "Not always, but sometimes." She nodded slowly, processing. Then, "I'm glad you didn't leave in there." "I couldn't," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean. I'm glad you're the kind of person who couldn't." He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, at the track warm-ups she hadn't bothered to change out of, at the pencil still in her hand, at the open textbook and the half-eaten cardamom cake between them, and felt something settle in him. Not pride exactly, something quieter. The recognition that the work of being who you are, the daily, unglamorous, expensive work of it, lands somewhere eventually, takes root, grows into the person sitting across from you, asking you the right questions. He washed the dishes after dinner. The small television ran the evening news in the background, a habit from his mother. the low, continuous presence of a voice narrating the world from a distance. A segment came on with Edward's face, and Mia came to the kitchen doorway to watch, and Darius dried his hands and stood beside her. They watched the old man speak in his plain, unhurried way, that a stranger had helped him hold on to his dignity on a Tuesday afternoon, and that he hoped people would carry that. Mia watched the screen with her arms crossed over her chest and her shoulder touching her father's arm. She didn't say anything. When the segment ended and the program moved on to something else, she stayed in the doorway for another moment, looking at the blank middle distance where the image had been. Then she said, "He looked taller on TV than he did in the store." Darius made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He did," he said. "He did look taller." Outside Meadowbrook Food Mart that evening, someone had taped a handmade sign to the window, a veterans resource number, the new assistance fund information, and a line at the bottom. "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect." By morning, there were flowers at the base of the window. Not a memorial, the kind of offering people make when they want to mark that something happened here, something worth the marking. Darius heard about the flowers from Edward, who called that evening. They talked for 20 minutes, longer than either of them had planned, the conversation finding its own shape, moving through Thomas in Asheville and Mia's track times and the fund at the VFW post, and eventually settling into a comfortable, wandering exchange between two men who had spent a Tuesday afternoon in the same grocery store and come out the other side knowing each other in a way that would take a long time to fully understand. Before he hung up, Edward said, "Same time tomorrow? The diner on 5th? "I'll be there," Darius said. He sat in the quiet of the living room after Mia went to bed. The television off, the dishes done, the bakery box folded flat on the counter. The house had the particular stillness of late evening, the kind that only comes when the day has finally finished with you, and you can set down whatever you've been carrying. He looked at the word on his forearm in the low lamplight. Dignity. The ink that was 23 years old now, beginning to soften at the edges the way all ink does eventually, working its way into the skin so completely it becomes indistinguishable from the person underneath. He thought about the pen that had sat unused in its holder beside Lauren's register, about how simple it would have been, about the 12 minutes and everything they had cost, and everything they had, improbably, returned. He turned off the lamp and went to bed. The next morning, Darius drove to the diner on 5th and Maynard, old vinyl booths, pie rotating under glass, and found Edward already at a table by the window with 2 cups of coffee waiting. He sat down. Strong coffee, slightly overbrewed, in the way of diners that have been making it since before anyone had opinions about it. Exactly right. They sat without talking for a while. Outside, the Wednesday moved past, people going where they go, doing the work of a week. A delivery truck idled at a red light. A woman walked a dog absorbed by a lamppost. A school bus passed with amber lights blinking. Edward looked at his cup, then at Darius. "You didn't just help me buy groceries," he said. Slow, deliberate, the plainest version, the only one worth saying. "You held on to my dignity for me. In that store. When I almost lost it in front of all those people." He paused. "I'm 78 years old. I've been working to hold on to that, the sense of my own worth, the sense that it doesn't shrink because the money runs short. You held it for me when I couldn't." Darius held the coffee cup in both hands. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, a pigeon landed on the sidewalk, considered something briefly, and moved on. Down the block, a truck backed into a loading dock. The ordinary sound of an ordinary morning, doing what mornings do. Darius looked at the old man across the table. The flag pin on the lapel. The hands wrapped around the mug. The face of a man who had lived a long time and was still here, still willing to say the true thing. He smiled. Small. Settled. The smile of a man who paid the full price of something and received its full meaning in return. and needs no audience for either. They stayed long past the coffee going cold, talking about Mia's track times, about the quality of an early highway before the freight traffic fills it, about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. Edward ordered pie. Darius drank a second cup of coffee. Outside the window, Crestwood did what it did on a Wednesday, unremarkable and ordinary and alive in the way of places where people are simply getting on with things, the way they always have, the way they will. In a kitchen not far from the diner, Mia Washington was getting ready for school, backpack by the door, track shoes by the stairs, moving through her morning with the quiet focus of a girl who had decided something, though she couldn't yet say precisely what. She would find the words for it. She had her father's patience for the things that mattered. And out in the world, the thread that had started with a jar of coins on a Tuesday was still traveling through the new fund and the revised policy and the community meeting and the flowers at the base of a window, carried forward by the ordinary, unheroic decision of one man who looked at another in a grocery store line and chose not to look away.